Chapter 31. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Reaper Scans Chapter 31. Vivian, TL. Osaka, PR, Ash, what will you have today? Brisket with a dash of basil powder. A red dot-haired, big dot-nosed youth laced the meat skewers quickly with spices. The aroma of cooked meat wafted across the marketplace, and the young man who was right beside took a whiff of it. Sure, Emile. Let's go with that. Give me more of the heat. It's getting colder these days. The weather's not letting up. Roy's face was red from the cold. He brushed the feathers off of his body and looked up at the overcast sky. 3 days had passed since Roy had come to search for a job. It was almost the 11th of November, and Samhain was drawing near. Roy had gotten used to the jobs in the marketplace over the last 3 days. The poultry booth provided him 30 EXP per day, and the herb booth was doing well too. Roy made friends out of Tross, his boss, Emile the grilled meat seller, and Rur the poultry booth owner. His days were spent between his jobs and night training. If nobody knew better, he was just an ordinary young man who'd come to the big city to better his life. The traces of the Witcher life were almost gone from his. Here's your brisket. Emile handed him a smoking, piping hot meat skewer the length of a forearm. Since you're a regular, I threw in some more meat for you. Roy went to a quiet corner and kept the skewer in his inventory space. He didn't buy the meat for himself, but for someone else. He was going to leave when dusk came, but Tross stopped him. Roy. A washerwoman called Trish ordered a bag of honeysuckle. Can you make a stop at her place? Tross asked. She's staying at number 80.9 in the lower part of the city. I have to watch over the booth, so I can't go. Tross had asked him to run errands over the last few days, but that was the first time he'd asked Roy to deliver something to the lower part of the city. That reminded Roy of the Sparrow Triad and Hank's warning. It has been a few days though. I can't be that unlucky, can I? Sure. Roy exited the marketplace and went east, where the slums were. The sky was gloomy, dark clouds congregating in the horizon, covering the blazing, setting sun. Once Roy stepped past the narrow, acrid ditch, he was met with short huts that extended as far as the eye could see. It was the slums, where everything foul was dumped. It didn't take long for Roy to cover his nose after he'd entered the place. Most of the huts were rickety and almost in shambles, and the ground was flooded with putrid water flowing from the sewers. The narrow alleys between the rows of huts were filled with garbage. The people who went past Roy looked pasty and tense. They were in nothing but rags, and when the autumn breeze blew against them, their expressions turned blank. Roy saw men who were just a few years older than he was, but their backs were already starting to deform from the strenuous labor they had to undergo. The air was filled with nothing but the stench of fish and the fador of excrements. Compared to the clean, proper, affluent area, the slums were pure hell. Calling them dirty was an understatement, and even Caire was much better. But the slums were what the world was in that era. Roy held down his desire to leave. He went to the washerwoman's house and handed the honeysuckle to the gaunt woman who was washing blankets outside her house. He was going to go back once he was done, but alarms started ringing in his head, and it felt as if something was pointing at him. Roy turned the corner and threw a furtive glance in the direction he came from. Just as he suspected, 2 thuggish men in gaudy clothes were tailing him from a distance. What are they doing? Why are they following me? Then he recalled Hank's warning. Just my luck. And this is my first time here too. Roy took a deep breath and kept walking. The men went on with their trailing, unaware of the danger the boy posed. In the slums of Aldersburg, a boy walked straight ahead on foul streets, his head hanging low. 2 men trailed him from a distance, their expressions dark. Some residents who were taking their clothes off the balcony noticed the scene, but all they did was lean forward and watch the show. Some hurried past the boy and spared him a glance before quickening their pace, unwilling to get into trouble. No one wanted to help. Roy quietly focused on his hidden hand crossbow and estimated the remaining space in his inventory before running ahead all of a sudden. "Come here, boy." His train of thought was interrupted by a sudden call. Roy looked up and saw a young, beautiful maiden waving at him not far ahead. "Is she calling me?" He looked back at the thugs and hesitated. "Very well then. There's too many people here. It'd be hard to get away if I killed them." The moment he approached the woman, an aroma assailed him, and he almost blacked out. She quickly grabbed his left arm. "Don't worry, boy. As long as I'm here, those bastards won't do anything to you." The woman winked at him, and the men who'd been following him stopped in their tracks. One of them had a tattooed neck and he spat at them. "You got lucky today, brat." The men left in a hurry, but not without cursing. Thanks for helping." Roy looked stiff, for he couldn't get used to the soft feeling on his arm. "Sorry, did I hurt you?" The woman let his arm go and patted his head. She stood at 5 feet 8 and looked around 20.4 or 20.5. Her green top and pleated skirt that covered her thighs showed off her perfect body. Her wine-red hair was tied in a ponytail, and a silver trinket hung from her slender neck. Her legs were as fair as snow, and a belt wrapped itself tightly around her torso. The lady's most attractive feature was her glittering eyes and full lips. It made her look seductive. *PR/N. 5 feet 8 is around 1.73 meters. It was as if her smile drove off the dark clouds. "I'm Vivian. What are you doing here alone, boy?" Vivian asked curiously, her voice gentle. "Didn't anyone tell you it was dangerous? The Sparrow Triad will do anything for money." Roy fell into a trance at the sight of her gleaming eyes, but since his body hadn't fully developed yet, he quickly recovered. Roy gave her a smile of gratitude. "You can call me Roy, Vivian. I was out for a delivery, but I didn't expect my luck to be this bad. This is my first time coming here." "Oh, and I thought those bastards were waiting for you," Vivian mumbled. "Where are you going now?" "The herb booth back in the marketplace. I'm going there to get some stuff too. Let's go together." Roy agreed to it after he stopped feeling the presence of those thugs. As they walked side by side, Roy eventually noticed that her hands weren't as smooth as her face. They had frostbite and were covered in dead skin and calluses. "Vivian, does that happen a lot here? Isn't there supposed to be someone telling them off?" "No, everyone's been preoccupied with the problems in the city center and the affluent area. The lower city is now a lawless place, so you have to be careful. Never come here alone." Roy asked anxiously, "Would those bastards come for you?" "You helped me." The lady stopped in her tracks, a look of gratification gleaming within her eyes. She looked at Roy as if he'd said something that had made her proud. "Don't worry. They won't do anything to me." Roy was surprised to hear that, and affection toward her welled up within him. They chatted as they went to the marketplace. Roy arrived at the booth a short while later, and Vivian waved at him, telling him to go before she left. Tross looked surprised for a split second when he saw the woman who'd come with Roy. "Done." "Yes." Roy paused. "Tross, do you know who Vivian is?" "The woman who came with me." Tross looked up, his beady eyes turning into slits, and he immersed himself in his fantasy. "Vivian is a good lady." He made an outline of a calabash in the air and licked his lips. "She has better curves than most women in the city, no. And she's kind too. Thanks to her, I managed to shake off the thugs who were trailing me in the lower city." Tross realized something, and he said apologetically, "I should have told you the lower city was in chaos, especially as of recent." "Forget it. Nothing happened anyway. She doesn't seem to be afraid of those thugs." "Do you know why?" Roy asked. Admiration showed on Tross' face. There's a three-story house in the northeastern part of the city center that's neighboring the lower city. It's the House of Cardell. It provides education for the civilian kids of Aldersburg at an affordable price, and they provide free lunch for the children. Vivian's the teacher, and she's beloved by the people. No matter how many bastards the Sparrow Triad has, the people of the city outnumber them. Why do you think they gave her a wide berth? He sighed. But ill fate always shrouds the kind. Her mother's mind is addled, and she has to support her father who's a drunkard. Her life's hard, since she has to take care of her family and the poor kids. Why does a kind, beautiful maiden like that have to live in the filthy slums? Tross looked like he wanted to help Vivian out, much to Roy's amusement. He knew Tross had a happy family. His wife and kids were healthy and alive. Can I ask for education in the House of Cardell, Tross? Roy was interested in the House of Cardell. He had plans to learn common speech. Since he'd settled down at his job, he could take some time off in the afternoon to learn. I think so, since you're young. Tross rubbed his chin. But the fees are going to be higher since you're not a local. But of course, it's still cheaper than asking for a scribe or someone else to teach you. Roy was delighted to hear that. He'd managed to find a place to stay and some good jobs, and then an opportunity to learn common speech was right in front of him. There shouldn't have been any problems if he went with this plan, and he could surprise Letho when he returned. Join our Discord to chat about the series and get notified when a new chapter gets released. https://discord.gg/reaperscans. Chapter 32. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Reaper Scans Chapter 32. Twisted Talent, TL. Osaka, PR. Ash. When Roy came back to the watermill that evening, he placed the warm meat skewer at the storehouse's doorstep and knocked on the door before going back into the living room. Roy mentioned Vivian to Hank and Mana, and the couple held Vivian in the same regard as Tross did. He then tried to ask why their daughter hadn't been sent to the House of Cardell to receive an education. Toya was a young girl, and being differently abled placed her in the minority. The House of Cardell might have taken her in, so Roy didn't understand why she hadn't been sent there. The couple told him they couldn't afford the fees, and they didn't think Toya was much of a learner. Ah, so they're really that kind of scum. Roy spoke no further on the matter and hastily finished his dinner. When he went back to his room, he saw a rare guest waiting for him. The oil lamp on the wall illuminated her petite figure. She was standing at the doorstep, her hunched back facing him, her shoulders lopsided. She was carefully wiping a handful of blueberries before placing them on the barrel outside. The girl heaved a sigh of relief once she was done, and she turned to go back to the storehouse. But then she saw Roy. Toya was stupefied, her happy smile frozen. She stared down nervously, and she trembled, but she didn't run. Don't worry, Toya. I mean you no harm. Roy attempted to put on his best smile, and he stayed 10 feet away instead of going up to her. I just want to say thank you for the fruits. They're delicious. Toya kept silent for a few moments, then she took a deep breath, resolving herself. Why that you aren't scared of me, she stuttered. Toya's voice was silvery and childlike, but also nervous. Why do you ask? Roy stared into her eyes. I don't think you're any different from any other girl. Toya forgot to breathe for a moment, and her heart skipped a beat. Nobody had ever told her that. Not even her father. She'd longed for someone to say she was just an ordinary girl instead of a freak, and tears welled up when her wish was finally fulfilled. Roy continued. Those uneducated rascals do nothing but spread mischief and misery, whereas you're already taking care of the livestock, poultry, garden, and fields. You're self-sufficient. Toya, you're a remarkable girl. Roy smiled almost too enthusiastically. I think a proper introduction is in order. I'm Roy, and I'm about the same age as you. My dad's a peasant in Lower Posada, and it's only been a short while since I came to Aldersburg. Toya, since you returned my gifts with your own over the last few days, then that makes us friends. Friends. Toya thought friends were things she could never get. She used to have friends when she was younger, but once her back started getting hunched, her friends avoided her like the plague. She couldn't even remember their faces. All she could remember was how everyone looked and they were cursing her. She wouldn't even dream about having friends. Toya started spacing out, looking as if she was at a loss. But then she started easing up and letting her guard down. Why don't we find someplace else to chat? Don't worry. It's just a normal conversation, something along the lines of what you had for lunch. Roy looked around them. The moon had shone on the vacant land he practiced on every night. Ripples spread across the pond as the night breeze blew across it, the moon's silvery light shrouding it. Roy heaved a sigh of relief when he saw the girl sitting on his left. He'd thought she would have run away. He'd never come into contact with a sensitive girl like her, and he was worried he might strike a nerve. This is a step in the right direction. Toya obviously wasn't used to the situation. She was staring down, her fingers interlocked. She didn't look at the boy beside her, nor did she look at her reflection in the pond, worried she might see a monster staring back at her. Relax, Toya. Hey, have you ever seen a magic trick before? No. And what's a magic trick? She asked carefully. It's a trick. You know how tricks work, don't you? I can show you one. Look closely. Toya was surprised that Roy was being so imperious, and she looked at him reflexively. Don't blink now. Roy extended his right hand, showed her his palm, then the back of his hand. Then he rolled his wrist once, twice, and thrice. Toya counted silently, and then her jaw dropped slightly, her eyes widening in shock as a beautiful card appeared out of thin air into Roy's palm. The card featured a redhead in a red dress. She radiated the beauty of a blazing flame, an air of mystery surrounding her. Roy rotated his wrist again, and a few turns later, the card disappeared into thin air. How did you do it, Roy? Toya's attention had been grabbed. It was a basic trick, but she'd never left Aldersburg since the day she was born, much less seen a trick. Where did you hide the card? A magician never reveals his secret. Take a guess, Roy said. Toya held her chin, letting her hair tumble down as she immersed herself in her thoughts, forgetting her unease and fear. And then Roy came to sit 1 foot away from her, interrupting her thoughts. Toya froze, cold sweat pouring down a face that had all its color drained. Her heart thumped in her chest, but not from diffidence. Rather, it was from fear and anxiety. Her long years of being abused made her fearful of those who approached her. She'd think they were there to torture, curse, or abuse her. Sorry for scaring you. Roy gave her an apologetic look, and he showed her his palms before moving backward until Toya regained a bit of composure. I was just trying to take the card. He pointed at her white apron. Believe it or not, Toya, that card is lying in your pocket right now. Toya searched her pocket with hesitancy, then she pulled out a card, the same one Roy had shown her. It was a shame she was illiterate. She didn't know the name of the lady on the card, but she fell into a trance looking at the lifelike, beautiful, sexy woman, a hint of envy gleaming in her eyes. Interesting, don't you think? Roy asked. You may take the card. Why? Toya was perplexed. She was already surprised Roy would give her herbs and food. I can't take this. It must have cost a lot. It's just an ordinary Gwent card, Roy answered honestly. Most innkeepers sell them. You can give me some fruits tomorrow if you think this is too expensive a gift. Toya held the card, looking reluctant. A long while later, she said, fine then. She kept the card in her pocket carefully. Who's the lady? Sabrina Glevisig. A sorceress in Ard Karé, Kedwen's capital city. A sorceress. You'll understand that in time, trust me. Let's talk about something else. Roy sat beside her, and this time, Toya didn't start seizing. She swung her legs like Roy was doing, perhaps to ease herself. 2 young passengers boarded the Moon in the lake. What do you do around the mill? Roy asked. I have to feed the pigs, clean the place, and weed the fields. And that's on top of what you'd mentioned before *PR/N. About her already taking care of the livestock, poultry, garden, and fields. Roy sighed. So young, to be bearing so many burdens. Most girls her age would either be married or helping out their families, but none were having it as hard as her. Do you have any hobbies? Painting, singing, dancing, or Gwent? I don't know how Gwent is played, so singing, probably. But I don't really do it. Mana always scolds me. Says my singing is as bad as the roosters who crow every morning. Everyone laughs at me too. Don't listen to them. Your voice is perfect for singing, Roy said, praising from the bottom of his heart. You could have sung in theaters if you went to any other city. It's quite late now, but if we have time, may I have the honor of hearing you sing? They talked about their lives. Roy was mostly doing the talking and asking, while Toya listened quietly, interjecting at times. Her answers were short and slow, but Roy managed to glean some useful information. She hadn't been born a hunchback. The symptoms had started 8 years ago, and they'd worsened. Her mother had died 5 years ago because she'd worried too much about Toya, and then her stepmother, the fat, harsh Mana, had come. Since then, Toya's life was nothing but endless labor, and her own father started becoming distant. Roy could feel the fear and helplessness in her answers, while Toya noticed that Roy's eyes were devoid of her father's disappointment and disdain, as well as her stepmother's hatred. They didn't contain any of the discrimination the children and residents had against her either. Instead, they were filled with patience and understanding. She felt something she hadn't in a long time, respect. That was the first time Toya had the desire to tell someone everything since her mother's demise, but that night was not the night for it. The moon climbed higher, and it had been an hour since they'd started talking. Do you really want to be my friend, Roy? She dusted her dress off and stood, the shining moon illuminating her hunched back and lopsided shoulders clearly. You got one thing wrong. Roy smiled. We are already friends. Can I talk to you tomorrow too? Of course. As long as I come back here, you're welcome to talk. Toya heaved a sigh of relief and limped back to the ramshackle storehouse. Roy saw her off. Toya gender. Female age. 13 years and 10 months status. Civilian HP, 30, mana corruption, * mana. 120, mana corruption, strength. 3 dexterity. 4 constitution. 3, mana corruption, perception. 6 will. 6 charisma. 4 spirit. 12, mana corruption, skill. Source, passive. Has awakened the power to sense chaos energy. Now a magic-sensitive human. Loved by the elements of earth, fire, water, and air. Absorbs mana automatically at all times. Can control mana and release spells after receiving professional and systematic training, performing feats most people couldn't. */N. Her stats are affected by the mana corruption, hence the arrows. The mana corruption increases her mana and spirit, but decreases her HP and constitution. Roy was reminded of what Letho had told him during the meditation lesson. If a magic-sensitive human were to awaken, but not be sent to a school for sorcerers to undergo training and tame the elemental energy within them, they would go insane from the rampaging mana. Worse, they might be transformed into a misshapen monster because of the uncontrollable mana. Obviously, Toya, the daughter of Hank, was one of the unlucky ones. She was given the gift of magic, but didn't know how to rein it in. Her misshapen body was, without a doubt, the effect of the uncontrollable mana within her. She would die much earlier than most if left untreated. Roy had helped her out of sympathy in the beginning, but now, he started coming up with a plan after he'd found out what Toya was. He might not have had the disposition of a sorcerer, but that didn't mean he couldn't befriend a future sorceress. It was an investment of sorts for him. Can't be a witcher without a few spell-weaving friends. Join our Discord to chat about the series and get notified when a new chapter gets released. https://discord.gg/reaperscans. Chapter 33. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Reaper Scans Chapter 33. House of Cardell, TL. Osaka, PR, Ash. The three-story house located in northeastern Aldersburg had a green roof and white windows, the fence surrounding the house forming a wide yard, and it had a sign hanging lopsidedly on the front door. On the left side of the yard was a field where seasonal vegetables were planted, and yellow vines crept along the wall on the side of the house. Behind them were colored, gnarly doodles made by children. A hornbeam over 40 feet tall stood in the center, its dense branches covering half the yard and the house. A long table that could seat 20 people was under the tree, but it looked shabby, obviously beaten up by the elements. Roy observed the area under the hornbeam for a while. Something stirred in him when he caressed the bark of the tree. This tree's at least 100 years old, and these weird signs. Must be the naughty kids who did this. Roy gently opened the wooden door on the first floor, and he heard a soft woman's voice coming from within. What greeted him were children sitting in silence and a gaunt, middle-aged woman writing on a blackboard with chalk. Our nation, Edirn, is located in the east of Mahakam, neighboring Temeria. Lyria and Rivia are situated in the south of Edirn, while Kedwen is in the north, and Blue Mountains in the east. Edirn's king is, as of current, Demoven III, the son of Verfuril. The nation's crest is a reddish-golden arrowhead with a black background. Vengerberg is its capital. The woman paused for a moment. Since ages past, Edirn has been the nation with the highest occurrence of peasant movements. The revolutionists have been fighting fiercely against the nobles and royalty to change the cruel tax system. Roy frowned after hearing that. Something feels off. Someone's eavesdropping, Miss Cardell. A scrawny young blond boy sitting in the back raised his hand, interrupting the teacher, and 60 pairs of gleaming eyes shifted their gazes to the boy at the door. Half of the kids were boys, and the others were girls. The youngest were about 5 or 6 years old, while the oldest were 14 or 15. Most of them were gaunt and in rags. Someone much older than the kids was sitting in the back, and she beamed when she saw the boy. "What brings you here, Roy?" Vivian waved at him. She was obviously wearing much more conservative attire than when she bumped into Roy. Vivian was in a plain gray dress, her wine-red hair tied back in a ponytail, and she looked so much younger. Roy hesitated for a moment, then he sat beside her. "Tross said you were a teacher in the House of Cardell. There was something I wanted to learn, so I came." Vivian nodded in approval. "Good decision. Knowledge is the only way to change your fate. Welcome to the House of Cardell. I'm Tom." "Hi, Roy." The boy who ratted on him extended his hand warmly, his features scrunching up as he gave Roy a toothy grin. It was a friendly yet amusing smile. Roy shook his hand. "Keep silent, children. Read through your history lesson. I'll be going out for a talk." The middle-aged woman led Roy to the office on the second floor. "You may call me Miss Cardell, child. What is your name? I'm guessing that you're here to learn common speech." Roy nodded. "I'm Roy, and I'm not a local." "Can I be admitted?" he asked nervously. Roy didn't want to have come all this way just to find out it was all for naught. "We welcome anyone under 16, and you look the age. The fee will be 20 crowns a month, and you'll have to work with me so I can register your personal information, all right?" Most of the people here are children. Cardell had a warm gaze, but her large, hook nose, laugh lines, and thin lips made her look terrifyingly stern. I have another question. Do you have enough money? Cardell was doubtful, since most students had their parents come with them. I work in the marketplace, so I have enough for the fees. Oh, yes, Miss Cardell, and that's also why I can only make it at noon. 20 crowns was far cheaper than what Roy had in mind. He already had enough to pay even without his jobs. Do as you will. As long as you can keep up. Cardell kept his registration form in the cabinet under the desk once she was done with it. Roy glanced at the thick stacks of forms neatly sorted in the cabinet. Once he paid the fee, he went back to the shabby classroom with Cardell, and his seat was between Vivian and Tom. The moment he went in, Roy noticed a few unfriendly glares coming his way. So not everyone welcomes me here. A few burly boys seated at the upper right corner threw hostile looks at him when they noticed him coming in. The oldest boys had looks of jealousy and warning in their eyes, telling Roy to stay away from their beloved toys. Roy didn't care about them, since he saw no need to fight with a bunch of brats. 20 crowns a month, and locals pay a lower fee. Are they running a charity business here? The money's barely enough for the food in this area. Roy made an estimate and noticed that there were 60.5 students in the class, excluding him and 2 teachers, who were Vivian and Cardell. Food alone would eat up a lot of the crowns, making the education almost free, and they even provided accommodation for special kids. What are you thinking about, Roy? Vivian looked at him, concerned. Can't get used to the place. I think it's fine, he whispered. Is everyone from the lower city? Yes. From ordinary families. She smiled. Get along with them, and don't bully them just because you're older. Ask me if you need anything. Roy nodded and started learning. The school was a shabby one. It had no tables or chairs. The students sat on the mat in rows. There were no quills or ink, only soot from coal that was used up. The papers were substandard, made out of grass. It was either that, or writing on the ground, erasing it, and writing it again. The conditions weren't great, but the lessons didn't come easy, so the students were extremely focused. After teaching the new students for a short while, Cardell started teaching the basics of the common speech from the north. It was a new language that was born after the conjunction of the spheres. The alphabet and grammar were similar to the Slavic languages from his past life. Roy felt bizarre, as if he'd gone back to his old world. For a moment, he thought he was a young high schooler sitting in his classroom as classes went on again. The original Roy had lived in this world for years, giving him a degree of understanding of the local language. To an extent, it increased his learning efficiency. Roy's mature thinking and brain power as well as his insight were a big help too. His spirit that exceeded a normal human's allowed him to stay focused for a longer time. More importantly, he was someone who went through a grueling education system in his old life. He wouldn't lose to anyone in the Witcher world when it came to rote learning. Thanks to those reasons, there was a chain reaction, and it made it easier for Roy to learn the new language. When it was almost noon, the long tables under the hornbeam were filled with people from the house of Cardell. The autumn breeze blew across the steaming food, and the aroma wafted across the yard, making the quiet children gulp. None of them made a move though. They were looking at the middle-aged woman, waiting for her command. Cardell stood up straight, as if she were a commander facing her soldiers before war. She nodded with approval at the children and said, Prophet Lebioda lit up 3 flames for the people. One is justice, the other is equality, and the last is the flames of dreams. Every child here has a dream. She lectured about dreams and what they meant. Our fathers and their fathers have always been farmers. Treasure the food they earned with their sweat and blood. Cardell waved forward, and everyone around the table moved toward the food. Everyone had hard bread, vegetable soup, pickles, and fish jerky. It wasn't great, but beggars couldn't be choosers. The students stuffed their mouths full of food, as if it would be taken away if they were just a bit slower. Roy was eating slowly at first, but he was surprised by how intensely the kids fought over the food. Influenced by their gusto, he inexplicably ate faster. It didn't even take the kids 15 minutes to finish all the food. Not one mouthful of soup was left. Even the leaves that fell into the plates were gobbled up by one little rascal. Roy was only half full though, and he could feel that most of the students felt the same. Tom puckered his lips. He was too scrawny to win against the other kids, even though he sat in the center. Roy had to say that was the best lunch he'd had since his rebirth. It was even better than the feast Seville treated him to. The best meal is the one fought over, huh? Suddenly, Roy thought there was another layer of meaning to the speech Cardell had given them before lunch. It was one of fairness and equality, but she'd let the kids fight over food after that. Is she already teaching them the harsh reality of life when they're still so young? The students had a short break after lunch, and they split into dozens of small groups, playing chase or chatting in the yard. Everyone was smiling, and once again, Roy thought he was back in PE class like in his old life. He couldn't believe a peaceful place like the House of Cardell existed in a magical world where revolution was in full swing. Roy was impressed. Even so, disturbance stirred in the land of peace. As long as someone was popular in a group, there would be unpopular ones. One of them just happened to be Tom, the boy who'd said hi to him. He stood in the corner alone, fiddling with his fingers, staring at the other kids with longing. "Aren't you going to play with them, Roy?" A fragrant scent assailed him, and Vivian crept up on him, her gaze filled with encouragement. A chill ran up Roy's spine, and he shook his head. "We have nothing in common." "What about Tom though? He looks like a sorry soul." Tom is an orphan. He's not like the other kids who have loving parents. The school's his home." She sighed. "And he's really frail, so the bigger kids keep ganging up on him, isolating him," she said solemnly. "Principal Cardell and I tried to tell them off, but it didn't work. We have too many things to take care of, so we can't keep our eyes on him. And we didn't show him enough care. So he's an abandoned child." Roy nodded. Bullying was a serious matter in modern society, let alone a shabby school like the House of Cardell. A half-hour nap time followed the break, and then it was time for Vivian's lessons. They included simple maths, tips to make life easier, and the meaning of words in common speech. When a boring lesson was taught by a gentle, gorgeous lady, it sounded interesting. At least the boys with Roy didn't blink as they listened. Once the clock struck 5, parents gradually came to the House of Cardell to take their children home to the lower city. Is it safe? Won't the human traffickers from the Sparrow Triad prey on the kids? Roy went up to Vivian as he looked in the direction they left. They kidnapped a girl 5 years ago. From the school. Someone saw her body in the ditch the next day. Her parents, overwhelmed by despair, spent all their savings to buy coal oil and set one of their bases on fire at night. They went into the burning base and died together with the Triad members who were sleeping. I can still remember the moment their charred carcasses were taken out of the ruins. Vivian was still shocked even though it had been a few years since then. From then on, the school and everyone in the lower city pressured the Triad. Even Baron Tavik was notified about the matter. The Sparrow Triad made some concessions and never did anything of the sort again. Roy was reminded of what Seville had told him. A good man's fury can demolish the entirety of the Mahakam Mountains. All right. That's another story I can tell Toya tonight. Come, Roy. Vivian held his arm, dragging him toward the classroom. This is your first day, so there must be a lot you don't understand. I'll teach it again. Roy was surprised she would do so. He had the feeling Vivian was overly nice to him since they'd first met, but he didn't think much about it. He was more than happy to master common speech sooner rather than later. Oh, why'd you come back, Roy? Tom, who was staring at the other children, hopped to him and held his other hand. His golden hair swayed with the wind, and he grinned toothily, looking like a puppy who was happy about its master's return. You don't have a home either. Why don't I play with you? Vivian pulled his ear, and he wailed in pain. Roy's going to revise today's lesson, Tom. Since you're here too, you're revising with him. Tom froze, and he tried to struggle free, but to no avail. Vivian dragged him into the classroom by his ear. You kept complaining about being alone, didn't you? Then you're going to learn with Roy every day after school. The boys' wails were sent up into the heavens along with the autumn breeze. The branches of the hornbeam creaked along with the wind, its yellowing leaves falling into the silence of the dusk. Join our Discord to chat about the series and get notified when a new chapter gets released. https://discord.gg/reaperscans. Chapter 34. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Reaper Scans Chapter 34. Picture, TL. Osaka, PR, Ash. The sky was overcast that day. Roy gripped the goose's white, slender neck tightly with one hand, while the other held a thin, razor-sharp blade. He placed it on the goose's artery and sliced. Blood spurted out, filling the wooden bucket beside him. He heaved a sigh and looked at his character sheet. Roy age. 13 years and 10 months old status. Civilian HP, 50 strength. 5 dexterity. 5.1 constitution. 5 perception. 7 will. 4.8 charisma. 5 spirit. 6 skill. Massacre level 3. Any attacking enemy within a 1-foot range will have a 10% chance of being feared. If their will is lower than yours, they will lose control of their bodies. The effect lasts 8 to 9 seconds, at most. There is a 10% increase in damage against 10 types of creatures. Crossbow Mastery Level 1. Meditation Level 1. Personal Level 2, 700/1000, Others. Unknown inventory space. 1 cubic meter. Roy had been working in the marketplace for half a month. Since he was only working in the morning, he would kill 20 chickens, ducks, or geese every day. The sheer number of kills finally made Massacre reach level 3. Hard work pays off. Guess wading through that stench wasn't for nothing. He managed to make 20.5 crowns and 300 EXP too. The Berberican fruits and blowballs he'd been consuming lost all effect, since his weakest stats, strength and constitution, had reached 5. It was on par with an average adult's, and it affected him physically. He was 2 inches * taller than he was in Kair. Roy's height was 5 feet 6 *, and muscles were starting to show. The boy was getting sturdier compared to how gaunt he'd been. PR/N. 2 inches is around 5.08 centimeters, and 5 feet 6 is around 1.68 meters. Roy wouldn't lose to any adult in strength or constitution. His features were getting slightly more sculpted, resembling a young adult's more than a boy's. Once the goose finished bleeding, he placed it in a bucket of steaming hot water before defeathering and disemboweling it. It was noon when he was done. Roy put the knife down, took off his apron, cleaned himself up, and woke Roar up from his nap before leaving for the house of Cardell. When Roy saw Vivian in the yard, she was sweating, and he handed her a satchel of herbs. Vivian took it from him, but she looked confused. What is this, Roy? Honeysuckle. It's a type of herb. Just put it in water and have it every day. Helps a lot with the ladies. You know I work for Tross, so getting this is easy. Why are you giving this to me out of the blue? As thanks. You've been taking care of me and helping me out a lot. It'd be remiss of me not to repay my debt, Roy answered. Vivian was silent after hearing that answer. Listen, Roy. You didn't have to give me this. That's not why I helped you. I can see that, but what's your reason then? He asked. Vivian, I've been wondering. Why do you care for me so much? You're even helping me with revision, just like how a sister would. Vivian took a deep breath and rubbed her wine-red hair. Melancholy filled her eyes as she answered quietly. I have a brother, and you give me the same feeling he does, so I see him in you at times. Roy was surprised to hear that. He'd never seen Vivian's brother in the school, nor did anyone talk about him. Is he dead? Vivian doesn't sound so sure about his condition either. How old is he now? Has he ever attended school here? Roy asked. Instead of answering him, Vivian looked at the clock outside the door and shifted the topic. It's almost time. We should go to the classroom now. All right then. Since Vivian was reluctant to divulge the details, Roy didn't pry any further, but his interest was piqued, and he wanted to find out about the story behind it. Strangely, Vivian didn't ask him to stay back that evening. Perhaps she was reminded of a sad memory because of their conversation. The night was dark, but the storehouse beside the watermill was illuminated by candlelight. A boy and girl sat on the haystacks around it, engaged in a whisper. Did you memorize the words I taught you yesterday? Yes. The girl scrunched her nose, feeling tense. Her eyes gleamed with trepidation, but also excitement. Good. Then, let's go with the usual. Write down the words bread, fish, potato, and morning. The girl stared down and dragged the haystack away. Then, she held a piece of shabby charcoal in her calloused hand. Using that as a pencil, she drew on the uneven ground, making out skewed words. Not bad, Roy said, praising as he checked her spelling. You're a smart girl, Toya. Smarter than most people, especially those little bastards who are bullying you. Those idiots have no right to laugh at you. They're mere trash. Toya blushed after being praised. Well, you've been a good teacher. It's all thanks to you. Raise your head, Toya. Be more confident. Toya puffed her chest out after hearing the encouragement. Her hunched back made her look bizarre, but for once, she smiled, even though it was stiff. It had been years since she'd done so. Roy paused for a moment. Are those little bastards still coming to harass you? No, remember what I told you. Wallop them with your broom the next time they come for you. Don't just take it. That'll make them bolder. If you can't win alone, then I'll help you once I come back. We'll teach them a lesson. Roy sat closer to her as he gave his advice, and their shoulders touched. Toya was used to physical contact after nearly 2 weeks of getting along with him. She didn't react as severely as before. Let's put aside the conversational words for today and learn something new. Roy pushed the haystack away and wrote the words Timiria, Gorsvilen, Isle of Than Ed, and Aretuza, on the ground. Roy, who drew a pentagram on your left sleeve? And it's only half finished. Toya was interested. Roy looked at the unfinished pentagram drawn in charcoal, and he thought about it. I don't remember. He couldn't think of anyone who'd do that no matter how hard he tried. Probably some cheeky kid in the house of Cardell. Probably did it when I wasn't looking. Let's talk about Timiria. It's a nation in northern Edern. The only thing between Aldersburg and Edern is the Mahakam mountain range. Toya, have you ever thought about traveling to another nation? Can I do that? She trembled, her eyes filled with terror, but also longing. She shook her head. No. It's been years since I left the mill. Timiria is too far away from me. I have to feed the chickens, water the flowers, sweep the floor, and finish a lot of chores every day. Hank and Mana won't let me leave. Just imagine it. Roy twirled his finger beside his head. They can't read your mind. Toya's eyes shone. Join our Discord to chat about the series and get notified when a new chapter gets released. https://discord.gg/reaperscans. Chapter 35. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Reaper Scans Chapter 35. Brother, TL. Asuka, PR, Ash. The leaves were falling from the hornbeam once again, and they danced in the air. Children chased them around, laughing happily, their joy spreading through the school. The classroom stood not far from it, and Roy was leaning against the rickety wall, staring at the incomplete pentagram on his sleeve, his frowning face standing out like a sore thumb. Vivian came up to him. "I wasn't feeling too great yesterday, so I didn't ask you to stay after school. Why don't I help you with your revision after school today?" Roy nodded, but he still looked tense, and he didn't listen closely to what she just said. "Oh, right. Miss Cardell wants you to see her in her office," Vivian said. "How do you feel about the school? Getting along with the other children? What about the classroom? Anything that needs to be improved?" Cardell put her hands on the table and peered at Roy, who was sitting across from her. Her eyes were filled with encouragement, but her laugh lines made it look like she was interrogating him. "I think everything's good," he answered honestly. "Especially Miss Vivian. She's been putting in a lot of effort. I wouldn't be improving as fast if not for her." "Oh yes, Miss Cardell. I have one question." Roy paused. "Does Miss Vivian have a brother?" Cardell shook her head. "No. She only has a father who's a drunkard, and a mother who's mentally ill. They depend on her for money, and because of that, she never got married." That only added to Roy's questions. That wasn't what Vivian had told him yesterday. "I thought she had a brother. That would explain why she takes great care of me. Maybe she thinks of me as her brother." Cardell shook her head seriously. "Roy, Vivian has been helping me with the school for a decade. I see her as my own daughter, and I know her very well. She has no siblings, and she cares about every student. Vivian's paying more attention to you because you're a new student." Roy didn't ask any more, as if accepting the explanation. Cardell patted his head and smiled. Some of the boys in the school liked the young, beautiful Vivian. They would fantasize about her giving them special treatment, and she thought Roy was one of them. "Roy, you have potential. You completed 2 months' worth of syllabus in 2 weeks. That's better than everyone else. Maybe you'll graduate as valedictorian in a few years. I'll draw your portrait then and hang it here. As a way of immortalizing you and encouraging the future children to be just like you." Cardell opened her desk's drawer and took out a few framed portraits for Roy to see. They were lifelike oil paintings that depicted young boys and girls. Roy looked at the portraits, and he froze at the sight of one of them. "Helheim, graduated on the 20th of December, year 1259. The portrait was of a boy in his teenage years. He had black hair and freckles on his nose. The boy would have looked ordinary and forgettable enough in a crowd, if not for the ugly scar under his right eye." Roy was sure he'd seen the boy before, but he couldn't remember from where. "Where do the valedictorians work?" Cardell had a proud look on her face after Roy asked her that. "I call the shots for a few things in Eden. They're talented, but they need training, so I recommend them to other cities like Lyria, Rivia, Upper Posada, Lower Posada, and even Vengerberg. Most of them work in the literary world. Some become historians, some scribes, some librarians." Roy pretended to have a look of longing on his face, but he thought Cardell was lying. "This school isn't as simple as it seems. They have another motive." Vivian was explaining some complex words to Roy after school when an unkempt, pudgy, middle-aged man barged into the classroom. He looked like a human-sized meatball that was wearing a dark, brown shirt drenched in liquor and scraps of food. His hair was disheveled and oily, evident he hadn't washed it in a while. He reeked of mold and looked like a beggar. He hobbled over to them and looked at Roy suspiciously before turning to Vivian and extending his hand. "Why didn't you come home last night, Vivian. Give me money, he demanded matter-of-factly. I'm out of booze. Vivian stood in front of Roy, pulling her behind him, her gentle look replaced with one of anger. I have no money for you. You damned girl. You spent it all. You know you should leave some for me. A frown creased the man's forehead. He bared his yellow teeth and spat on the ground. Bring the money back tomorrow, or else, he threatened before leaving, muttering something under his breath. Is that your father? Roy asked carefully. He noticed Vivian wasn't looking too happy. Yes. He's my father, Bob, Vivian answered quietly. Scary, isn't he? Well, Roy didn't think it was appropriate for him to criticize someone else's parents. Maybe he's just acting that way because he's drunk. Don't worry. You can say what you want about him. That man hasn't been sober his entire life, and he doesn't care about his family. The first thing he does when he wakes up is drink, and the only time he'll sleep is when he's drunk. Vivian seemed unperturbed by her father's actions. She was numb to them at this point. Vivian sounded resigned and mocking. Anyone with a father like that is just unlucky. Bob has never done his job as a father. He doesn't even care about his missing son. His son. Vivian's brother. The one Cardell said was non-existent. Roy looked at her weirdly. What's going on, Vivian? Can you tell me about it? Since he needed to persuade her, Roy added, I've been following a witcher around for a while. To be precise, my teacher is a witcher from the Viper School. He's taught me ways to handle weird and bizarre happenings. Maybe I can help you. Is that true? She arched an eyebrow, doubtful of what Roy had just said. From what I've seen, the shape and color of your eyes are different from those witchers. Because I'm still a disciple, and I haven't passed the trial of the grasses yet, so I'm no stronger than an ordinary human. Roy then talked about his journey with Letho. Vivian kept quiet for a while. All right then, Roy. I trust you, though I don't understand why a witcher's disciple is working at an herb booth in the marketplace. Since you're willing to hear me out, and you have experience, I can tell you what happened. At least you won't think me mad. She took a deep breath. It's incredible though. I can't even be sure about what my brother looks like, or how old he is, or where he is right now. She laughed to herself, and she looked conflicted. Even she herself thought it was ludicrous. Everyone thought I'd gone insane when I first told them about my brother. Nobody had ever seen him. Not Miss Cardell, and none of my cute students either. Nobody remembers I have a brother. I tried to prove to that drunkard that he had a son by showing him boy clothes that were lying around, but he said I had a bastard son instead. My mother doesn't know what I'm talking about. It was then I realized that everyone would have thought me possessed by a demon if I'd kept that up. They would have burned me at the stake. Since then, I kept it a secret and led my life normally. It's been 2 years since then. Vivian went quiet again. Her explanation added to Roy's questions. That's weird, Vivian. If nobody remembers him, then how are you so sure you have a brother? Because I have evidence. I told you there were clothes that belonged to a boy in my home. I would show them to you, but that drunkard burned them all. Regret flashed in her eyes, then she resolved herself. Vivian was sure she wasn't imagining things. Also, since I started working with Miss Cardell, I made a habit of recording my life in my journal every 2 weeks or once a month. It's to jot down everything that left an impression on me, whether it be at home, the school, or the streets. It's been 10 years. She stopped for a moment. I would read my journal once in a while. I've set a high bar for myself. My dream is to become someone respected and well-beloved like Miss Cardell one day, so I would correct my inappropriate actions after reading my journal. You've done it though, Vivian. Everyone in the school likes you, and even their parents do too, Roy answered earnestly. He thought Vivian was pushing herself too much. No, I still have a long way to go. She shook her head and spaced out at the sky. When I went through my journal 2 years ago, I found some strange records. She stopped, but then said solemnly, aside from me, that drunkard, and my poor mother, there was another person in my house. Roy felt goosebumps on his skin, for Vivian's story had taken an eerie turn. She took off her necklace, pressing down on it to open it. She took out a wrinkled piece of paper and laid it out. It was the size of a palm, and on it was a crude drawing of 2 people. One of them was taller than the other, and they were holding hands. On the left was a tall lady, and on her right stood a boy with red cheeks. They were beaming, and the 2 looked close. They were obviously siblings. Then I found a bunch of clothes for boys in my home. The clothes are far smaller than the drunkard could handle, and there's also this weird drawing in my necklace. This is why I'm sure I have a brother. But for some unknown reason, I can't remember him. Vivian looked confused and frustrated, and she only continued after a while. That feeling was strongest when I helped you out in the slums. I know you and him must be really alike. Even though I don't know what he looks like, I have a feeling he exists. Oh, that explains why she's so nice to me even though it was our first time meeting each other. But Roy still thought something was off. He decided to go along with her story to find out what was happening. Pardon me, Vivian, but can I see that part of the journal? Of course. Ask me if you come across words you don't know. I can explain them. Vivian looked tense, and she whispered carefully, but don't tell anyone about this before we have any definite evidence. This is for your own good, understood? Join our Discord to chat about the series and get notified when a new chapter gets released. https://discord.gg/reaperscans. Chapter 36. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Reaper Scans Chapter 36. Journal, TL. Osaka, PR, Ash. Roy went with Vivian to the 3rd floor of the school where the dorms were located. She would stay in her room whenever she needed to stay the night at school. Miss Cardell and the homeless students' rooms were beside hers, though nobody was there at the moment. Vivian led him into her room, which was far shabbier than how it had looked from the outside. The walls were cracked and filled with black mold. There was nothing but a table, a chair, a clock, a full-body mirror, a wooden bed with a blanket on it, and a brown wooden crate near the bed. After Vivian unlocked the crate, she took out a small stack of wrinkly, yellowed, rough paper and placed it on her desk. You should understand a bit more about how I feel once you read them. Roy nodded and read them in silence. Vivian sat beside him nervously and explained the meaning of the words he didn't know. The handwriting was slender and beautiful, but since the quill and ink were poor, some of the words stuck together, forming black blobs of ink. It ruined the aesthetic, but didn't hinder the reading. 12th of May, 1256. That drunkard almost tore apart the house today, but there was not 1 crown to be found. He has no money for liquor, and the innkeeper doesn't allow him to put it on his tab anymore. He was finally sober for a day, and his rotten conscience seemed to have healed, even if just for a bit. The day felt like a dream. The 4 of us sat around the table in our dingy house, celebrating my poor mother's birthday with smoked fish. O wise prophet Lee Biota, grant us your blessing, and may we have such a birthday celebration next year. The 4 of us. Roy rubbed his eyes. He thought he read something wrong. Vivian, her drunkard father, her mentally ill mother, Anne. Did you have a guest over? Roy looked at her. Or is this a wrong entry? If my memory serves me right, we never had any guests over for my mother's dinner. To be more precise, nobody ever came to our house, aside from the innkeeper who wanted the money the drunkard owed him. Did you say it's a wrong entry? Vivian continued calmly. I'm in charge of Cardell's math class. Do you think I would make an elementary mistake like that? I can't mistake 3 for 4. Just keep reading. Roy patiently went back to the journal and read another entry. It was shorter. 20th of January, 1257. He got into a fight with Miguel, who insulted our father. That man came to the school as drunk as usual, and as always, he came to me for money. Nothing but insults and profanities came from him. He's worse than the thugs from the Sparrow Triad. I agree with what Miguel had said. That drunkard is nothing but a bastard. Roy was curious about who he was. From the entry, he could deduce that he and Vivian had the same father, which meant he might be her brother. 19th of August, 1257. Miss Cardell, the person I respect the most, talked to me today. She first praised me for my contribution to the school and told me to keep up the hard work for the sake of producing great students. My ultimate goal is to get one of the students into Oxenford Academy. Not even Miss Cardell managed to do that. And then Miss Cardell told me about __. She suggested I should care more for __. Miss Cardell said I shouldn't overlook him no matter what, since I am his family. It was then I realized that the drunkard, my poor mother, and I have been overlooking him since a while ago. Did you notice something? She suddenly pointed at a line on the page. Something's missing here. Yes. It's weird. Roy looked flummoxed. 2 parts here are missing. Who were you talking about? Who should you care more for? Obviously someone left this blank. Looks like a name. Vivian heaved a sigh. I knew I wasn't seeing things. It's obvious the blanks are supposed to be my brother's name. Keep on reading. There are a few more entries like this. Vivian pointed out 8 other ones that had the same thing. A mysterious character was in all of the entries, but none of them spoke about the character's name, what he looked like, or his age. But he could see that the mysterious character was close to Vivian and her family, and that he had attended the house of Cardell. The final entry was written on the 4th of October, 1258. The date was just a little more than a month ago. That drunkard had too much to drink. He started going on a rampage, slapping and throttling me, demanding money. If I'd been even a moment late when I'd pushed him away, I could have died. I ran away in tears, and ___ came after me, worried about my safety. We went to the school and chatted for the whole night. There were a lot of leaves that had fallen from the hornbeam that night. Roy leaned back on the chair, massaging his temples as his eyes closed. When he sorted all the information that was swirling around in his mind, the first realization he had was that one of the entries contradicted Miss Cardell's testimony from that afternoon. If Miss Cardell didn't think Vivian had a brother, there was no reason for her to ask Vivian to care for someone who didn't exist. When Roy thought about it, Miss Cardell didn't look like she was lying, whereas Vivian was being too paranoid. Suspicious. Then Roy thought, Miss Cardell, Tross, Hank, and the journal proved that Vivian has a drunk, abusive father and a mentally unstable mother. If I include that broken family into the equation, does that mean that the gorgeous, impeccable Vivian has some sort of mental illness? That's a logical conclusion. Roy was more than ready to believe that Vivian was mentally ill, rather than her having a mysterious brother nobody had ever seen. When he looked at her closely, Roy noticed that her chest was heaving. Her breath was shallow, and her gaze was full of yearning. Has he ever appeared after the 4th of October, 1258? No, he has disappeared since. She shook her head in disappointment. The earliest entries he was mentioned in date back to 1256 and before, but since it's too far back, there's no use in thinking about that. Roy tapped the desk. What's the newest entry after the 4th? 1st of November. On Sauvine. Roy took a deep breath. So he might have gotten into an accident between the 4th of October and Sauvine. I had the same idea. Vivian's voice was trembling. What do you think, Roy? Do you trust me, as a Witcher's disciple? Or do you think I've gone mad, just like everyone else? Do you think I just came up with the idea of having a brother who only exists in my imagination? Roy wanted to say yes, but he thought he shouldn't agitate her. There are many things that can't be explained in this world, so I believe you, Vivian. I'll find more on him. Roy had a rough guess, but there was nothing to support his conjecture, since Vivian was his only lead. He needed to find more definite evidence to prove that everything was just Vivian's imagination. Vivian tapped her chest and sighed in relief. She looked touched that Roy trusted her, and she held his hand. I've heard about the Witcher's rule. I'll prepare the bounty. We can talk about that later. Roy wasn't someone who'd do everything for free, but he would help someone who did everything they could for the House of Cardell as long as it wasn't too dangerous. A Witcher should never fight an enemy he can't win against. He needed to go on some reconnaissance. Thank you, then. Please help me locate him. But be careful, and don't tell anyone about this. I understand. Join our Discord to chat about the series and get notified when a new chapter gets released. https://discord.gg/reaperscans. Chapter 37. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Reaper Scans Chapter 37. Ask Around, TL. Osaka, PR, Ash. Since Roy had decided to investigate the matter, he'd have to take a day off from his job. Before he went back to the watermill that evening, he told Ruhr and Tross about it. Tross agreed to it readily. You want a day off tomorrow? Sure. You've done great over the past 2 weeks. You'll still be paid the agreed wage. But why though? Do you have a girlfriend in Aldersburg? Going on a date with her? I've been where you are right now, lad, so here's a piece of advice. A woman's greed runs deeper than hell. Your crowns are going nowhere if you spend them on her. They'll never be satisfied. Stop teasing me, Tross, Roy shot back. I don't have a girlfriend. I'm searching for someone in the lower city, but I can't tell you who I'm looking for. Tross gave him a solemn reminder. Then, be careful. After resting at the watermill for the night, Roy went to the lower city the next day. The sky was overcast. If he wanted to verify Vivian's testimony, he had to see the drunkard who'd come to the House of Cardell a day ago to ask Vivian for money. In other words, her father. There's no way he'll forget about his son, no matter how drunk he is. Roy found out where Vivian's house was a couple weeks ago. It was a rickety wooden house in the easternmost part of the lower city. The house was easy to find, and Roy had gone in the morning to avoid bumping into the Sparrow Triad thugs again, but luck was not on his side. The moment he stepped onto the slum streets, he felt someone glaring at him from behind. When he looked behind him from the corner of his eye, he saw a bald, burly man with a tattoo on his neck following him. The man was wearing a thick, yellow coat, black pants, and long boots. He looked like Letho, but his expression wasn't the same. Letho was a distant man, while the burly thug looked brutish, as if his rage were about to explode any minute. He was around 6 feet 4 *, his neck short but thick, his coat bursting at the seams. The man looked like a bear standing on its hind legs. PR/N, 6 feet 4 is around 1.93 meters. The morning wind cut through him like blades. There weren't many people on the streets at that hour. Most were either still sleeping or already in the marketplace, working. Roy pretended not to notice him. Instead of yelling or calling for help, he hastened his steps and left the streets, turning into a remote, dark, squalid alley. The man sped up too. A short while later, they started to jog, and the chase went on for a few minutes. Roy's turns eventually made him run into a dead end, a wall filled with algae and putrid fluids that was blocking him. The man behind him took out a handkerchief laced with drugs, approaching Roy with a sneer. Hey man, I don't think I've crossed you, huh? Roy turned and forced a smile, showing his hands to the man who was 30 feet away. I'm harmless. Can't you let me go? I can give you all the money you want. The man stopped 20 feet away, and greed gleamed within his eyes. I can take whatever I want once I get my hands on you anyway, he said gruffly. But you can try asking for help. See if anyone will lend a hand. Their difference in size was like that of a child and an adult. The man didn't see any weapon on Roy, and he thought Roy was just harmless prey, nothing more than something he could easily kill. No harm in telling him something before he dies. And then a crisp clang rang out in the alley as Roy suddenly tossed a handful of crowns onto the ground, stunning the man. It was the first time he'd faced such a situation, and he reflexively went to take the crowns. Roy asked a question. You're one of them, aren't you? The Sparrow Triad. Didn't expect thugs to be more professional now. It's not even 7, and you're already staking out here. Aren't you guys cold? It's your fault for being stupid, brat. The burly man quickly took the crowns before snapping out of it and darting toward Roy. Save your questions for the mine. The man stopped moving before he could react. The last thing he felt was pain in his right eye, and then he was gone. The man's brutish body still took 2 steps forward from the inertia before falling with a thud. He knelt on the ground before falling face first, as if he were groveling at Roy's feet. A moment later, blood started pooling around him, flowing out of the holes in his head. A message showed up in the character sheet. You have killed Fossa. 20 EXP gained. Roy heaved a sigh, and the hand crossbow disappeared into thin air. He went to pat the carcass, and it disappeared too. After everything he'd been through, human corpses were no different from animal carcasses. He went to pick up the crowns and the bolt that had blood and flesh stuck to it. Once he placed those in his inventory space, he couldn't fit in a single more thing. Roy was happy with his kill. If this were in the past, the bolt would have just stuck into his victim's head if he'd shot for the eye. Since the man was less than 10 feet away, the bolt pierced through his head thanks to the activation of crossbow mastery and Massacre's added damage. It's better than I'd imagined. He spent so much time talking just so he could confirm one thing. Being tailed by the Triad for the first time might have been a coincidence, but the same thing happening a second time, and at such an hour, couldn't have been a coincidence. Someone sold me out. Not many people knew he would come to the lower city that morning, and when he thought about why he'd gone to the lower city last time, he had a suspect in mind. So the Sparrow Triad was tipped off, and they were going to sell me off to the dwarves as a miner, huh? Roy sighed, his mood marred. Being sold out didn't feel good. He thought they could have been friends after getting along for a few weeks. He thought he could have trusted that person. Am I too naive? Then Roy left the alley, leaving nothing but a pool of blood behind that told of an unknown murder. After going through the dirty alleyways, he arrived in the depths of the lower city, and a small house sat quietly within wooden fences. Vivian's house was more dilapidated than Roy had imagined. The walls were cracked and filled with dirt. The roof was leaking, and only a piece of black, tattered cloth was covering it. A pudgy, morbidly obese man was sitting on a stump in the yard, spacing out. His cheeks were sickly red, his eyes murky with a drunken stupor. Who are you looking for, brat? Why'd you come to this shithole of a place? Bob glanced at Roy impatiently. He thought he'd seen Roy before, but the alcohol was stripping him of his memory. You're Vivian's father, aren't you? Roy went into the yard and smiled sheepishly. I'm Roy, a student from the House of Cardell. I need to ask you some questions. Well, that's a shocker. What business does a brat like you have with me? Bob snapped out of his stupor, staring at Roy in surprise. If it's about the best inn in the city and all things liquor, I can answer every question you got, but if it's something else, then sorry. No idea. Bob then paused. It's the morning. Shouldn't you be in the House of Cardell? He sniffed the air and licked his lips. Greed gleamed in his eyes when he saw Roy take out a green bottle out of nowhere and swing it before him. Bob had been drinking for years, and he could see that Roy was holding a bottle of dwarven liquor, his favorite booze. It had been a couple days since he'd had any alcohol, for he had no money to pay for it. The familiar scent of liquor broke through his defenses easily. "Ask away, lad. I'll answer anything as long as I can get that in the end." Bob stared at the bottle like the addict he was, his gaze filled with yearning. Roy nodded. The best way to get an answer from him is to give him what he likes. "Get a cup, Bob. I'll let you have a cup every time you answer a question." "All right. Give me a second, and don't leave. How many people are there in your family?" Roy swirled the cup of clear liquor in front of him, and Bob fidgeted. He clawed at the cup, trying to satiate his itch. "3, he answered. "Me, my crazy wife, and that disrespectful daughter." "Think harder." Roy placed the cup near him and moved at the moment Bob tried to get a hold of it. "Give it to me. I said there's only 3 of us, you br. "No, sorry." Bob put his palms together, his flabby muscles trembling. "I swear there's only 3 of us in the family, Roy," he said humbly. "If I am lying, then I shall never drink again. Here." Bob gulped it down and heaved a sigh filled with ecstasy, as if he'd reached heaven. As Roy looked at Bob's vulgar form, he told himself to never get addicted to any substance. Roy composed himself and asked another question. 5. "No, was there anyone who lived with you for a long while 10 years ago?" "No." Bob looked angry. "They were afraid I'd be a burden. Does Vivian have any siblings?" "That girl is an only child," Bob answered firmly. "She has no siblings. I might be drunk, but I ain't retarded. I won't forget how many children I have." "Then do you have any children who died early? Or does Vivian have any siblings who died in an accident?" "Roy, my boy, what kind of question is that?" Bob had answered with a question, holding down his urge to drink. "Why are you looking into my family so much? Just answer me." He swirled the cup of liquor again. "Don't think about anything else." "All right then, I'll tell you. My wife only gave birth to Vivian." Then he sighed. "I want a few more children, but my body's wrecked since I have too much to drink. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Want to hear about it in detail?" 15 minutes later, Bob was sleeping near the stump after finishing the liquor. He denied ever having a son even when he was half sober. I don't think he could have lied in that condition. Roy left the drunken man alone and went into the rickety house. What greeted him was a gaunt, pasty woman with unruly hair sitting at a round table near the doorstep mumbling to herself eerily. Roy observed her in silence before going to sit across from her. "Ma'am, the woman said nothing. Even though her gaze met Roy's, it didn't look like she saw or heard him. Apparently, she was in her own world. A grin would carve itself onto the woman's wrinkled face at times, but the next moment, her eyes would widen in rage. And then she'd stare down, looking crestfallen. Roy was flummoxed. "Lowry, my dear, did you get thinner? Working too hard at school again? I made your favorite. Have some." The woman stared at her left and mumbled to the air gently. Then, she ladled some steaming vegetable soup from the cauldron in the table's center before pouring it into the bowl on the left. "Take it slow. You're a lady. Wolfing your food down won't help you get married." Lowry. Probably Vivian's nickname. The woman then put her hands on her hips and glared to the right. "What on earth did you do, Bob? You look like a mess. Did you get into a fight after you got drunk again yesterday? You smell like shit. Don't even think about getting into bed with me tonight. Do it again and you're getting the boot." "Humph." She prepared more vegetable soup and dug into it. An empty bowl with a ladle in it now sat before her. Roy watched her in silence. Once she finished her soup, he tried calling out to her a few more times, but to no avail. Since he couldn't communicate with her, Roy left the house and went around the area. He asked the residents who were smoking in the yard about Vivian's family, and as expected, they were sure that Vivian's family only consisted of 3 people. There's no way everyone's lying. Join our Discord to chat about the series and get notified when a new chapter gets released. https://discord.gg/reaperscans. Chapter 38. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Reaper Scans Chapter 38. Non-existent, TL. Osaka, PR, Ash. There was still some time before noon. Once Roy left the lower city, he quickly went back to the house of Cardell and slipped inside quietly. The students were listening to Miss Cardell's history lessons calmly, while Vivian was sitting alone in the back. Great. I came back just in time. Everyone's in class except for me and the kitchen lady. Roy scurried to Miss Cardell's office on the 2nd floor, but the door was locked. He went to the leftmost part of the corridor and leaned out to look at the window closely. The window was open, and it wasn't far from the corridor, nor too high up from the ground. Roy took a deep breath and hunkered down on the guardrail. He squatted a few times, estimating the strength needed for him to reach the window. And then he sprung to the side, his arms spread open like wings, and he grabbed the windowsill. He moved his upper body and leaped into the room, agile like a cat. It wasn't too hard for Roy to do that, since his body was on par with that of an adult's. The room was in the same condition it had been in during Roy's first day. He went toward the desk behind the book rack and tugged on the drawers and cabinets. Alas, everything was locked, but he didn't want to leave without any clues, so he searched the rack, the sofa, and even the pencil case. Half an hour later, Roy surprisingly found a bronze key in a book called Time of the Moon. When he tried using it to unlock the cabinet near the desk, the door opened for him, revealing a few stacks of neatly sorted papers. One of them recorded Roy's information. As Cardell had said, every new student had gone through the same process, recording their date of entry, name, gender, age, address, family, and simple description, like hair and eye color, birthmarks, as well as scars. Roy thought that if Vivian's brother did exist, and if he'd attended the house of Cardell, then there must have been records of him. There should be traces if he's a real person. Even if nobody remembers him, the records should. Cardell had sorted out the papers according to the student's year of entry. Roy counted the stacks and realized there were 13 of them. In other words, the house of Cardell had existed for at least 13 years. There were only a couple of registration forms in 1248, presumably when the school started operating. More students had enrolled over the years. Since around 4 years ago, the number of new students had been staying at 30 per year. Most of the new students would enter around May, the same time the older students had their graduation. Almost nobody joined in the middle of the year like Roy. These papers are the House of Cardell's historical records. They talk about the story of a school that serves the poor because its founder had a dream. It talks about how they grow in an era where chaos, triads, and revolutions are rife. The papers were light, but they held great weight. Roy flipped through them carefully, but he didn't read them word by word. It would be too inefficient, and he didn't know how to read some of the words. All he looked for were the year of entry, name, and family of the students. And he only searched the records that were within 6 or 7 years, as the House of Cardell only allowed a student to stay for 5 at most. Hill. No. Flick. No. Vivian's not his sister. Carse. No. The address doesn't match. He finished flipping through 200 registration forms in 15 minutes. There were a few empty forms in between, perhaps used by Cardell to motivate herself, and he double and triple checked them. After his third check, Roy heaved a sigh and stacked the forms before putting them back into the cabinet. He had a complex look on his face. He didn't find anything on Vivian's brother. That made him think that his investigation was nearing its end. He thought the conclusion was logical, but also hard to accept. Is Vivian really going mad? Some of the records held names Roy was familiar with, names that belonged to children who were still in the school. Two of them left an impression. One was Miguel, the child who got into a fight with him, and the other was Helheim, the boy with a scar under his eyes, the one Cardell had drawn a portrait of. Roy looked at the clock. There was still an hour until 12. He was planning on asking Miguel some questions after lunch to gather some final evidence. Before he left, Roy hesitated and opened some other drawers out of curiosity. Books, quills, ink. Roy rummaged through the drawers. Makeup products. Didn't expect the stern Miss Cardell to be someone who cares about her appearance. This is. Roy found a wrinkled pamphlet in the third drawer near the corner by accident. Vernon Ryan, the great leader of the Aldersburg revolutionists, was fighting for the people's rights when Baron Tavik, in all his cruelty, incarcerated him for 3 months. The just revolutionists who went to the protest march were defeated by the Baron's forces, but the revolution shall not wane. A new team is assembling. Roy finally had the answer to one of his questions. He finally realized who Helheim, the valedictorian, was. The man with the scar was one of the revolutionists, the one in the cape he'd bumped into when he and Letho were leaving Seville's residence. Cardell's hiding this pamphlet in her drawer, but she said she sent the great student somewhere else to work. But obviously, she has a lot to do with the revolutionists. Roy made a daring presupposition and thought that Cardell was important for the revolution. He thought she might have founded the school to raise new revolutionists. And then, he was reminded of his first day, when he'd overheard her lessons. Back then, he had a strange feeling that Miss Cardell was biased toward the revolutionists. She criticized the nobles of Aldersburg, and even the whole of Edirne. Wait, this makes sense. House of Cardell's backers are the revolutionists. If I keep this up and stay for a few more years, Cardell's going to persuade me to join the revolution. Roy took a deep breath, unsure of what to feel. He was there to find out more about Vivian's brother, but he didn't expect to find Cardell's skeleton in the closet. So does she have anything to do with Vivian's brother? Did she take him into the revolution, like how she did with Helheim? Roy dismissed that idea quickly. No matter how powerful Cardell was in the revolution, she was still human. It was impossible for her to erase Vivian, her family, and her neighbors' memories. Even Helheim had a portrait, but Vivian's brother didn't. Bob's testimony and the missing form were enough evidence that Vivian's brother did not exist. If Miguel denied the boy's existence too, then join our Discord to chat about the series and get notified when a new chapter gets released. https://discord.gg/reaperscans. Chapter 39. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Reaper Scans Chapter 39. The Forgotten Person, TL. Osaka, PR, Ash. After making sure the room was the same as before he'd come in, Roy went back into the classroom like nothing had happened. He cast observe on everyone in the school, including Vivian and Cardell, especially Cardell. He spent the most time on her, but all her stats were that of a normal person. Everyone else too. None of them were powerful entities or mysterious beings in the game. Roy was surprised to find out that a human female over the age of 40 like Cardell had a better physique than that of an average adult. Her stats were 7 on average, and she had 2 skills. Trained, and dagger mastery. Roy knew she was related to the revolution based on that alone. After they had lunch, Roy went to Miguel, who was frolicking with the boys on the field. The boy was burly and had a lot of pimples, and he was about to graduate in the coming year. He ignored Roy at first, looking at him with disdain, obviously disliking him. He was jealous of Roy, for he was cared for by the beautiful Vivian, something Miguel never was. But he became all smiles and answered Roy's question once he was paid 2 crowns. Vivian's brother. Miguel was shocked when he heard the question. I've been here for 4 years, and I'm the kid's senior. I've been paying a lot of attention to Vivian for 4 years, and I can say for sure that she has no siblings. I'm not the only one who likes her. See those brats there? They like her too. You too, don't you? Don't lie. When Miguel heard the next question, he gasped. Fight. Are you out of your mind, Roy? Don't you think that's absurd? I've never even seen her brother, so how could I fight him? Oh, I do dislike her father though. If I got the chance, I might just cover his head with a sack and mess him up. Miguel's answer was within Roy's expectations. He then picked a few more younger students and took them aside to ask about Vivian's family. They provided the same answers. Roy wasn't sure if anyone was lying. He couldn't prove it either, since he didn't know how to cast Axii, but it was impossible to get every child to lie like it was nobody's business. It's credible, and more than likely. Roy glanced at Vivian, who was playing with the children under the hornbeam with a smile. He felt sorry that Vivian was mentally ill. Since his primary investigation had ended, he would go talk to her and see if there were any more leads. Roy and Vivian were standing outside the dorms on the 3rd floor, letting the cold wind blow against them as they watched the children and parents leave the premises with Miss Cardell ushering them out. I have some clues about your brother, Vivian. You found something. Vivian had longing in her eyes. She held his hand nervously and dragged him to her room. Is it a big clue? Well, Roy massaged his temples. He didn't think it was appropriate to tell her straight. Did you ask everyone in the school about him? Of course I did. She frowned, sighing. I told you nobody admits he exists. What do you think, then? Roy tried to be as gentle as possible. If he really exists, then why does nobody remember him? Not even your parents. That's impossible to explain, and I've been looking into that for 2 years. She clenched her fists and paced in a panic. The setting sun's light draped over her, granting her a look of eerie holiness. I've eliminated all the improbable possibilities, and arrived at one conclusion: all our memories about him have been erased. That's why I asked for your help. Witchers come across weird stuff all the time, don't they? Haven't you come across something similar? Like how a mysterious monster could take away my poor brother and erase all traces of him. Erased all traces of him. Roy was surprised. He didn't want to think about that possibility, but he couldn't deny it. However, he had evidence to prove that wasn't the case. Have you ever thought that even if everyone's memories were erased, some things couldn't disappear? You're saying, Vivian became serious. The registration form. Roy looked into her eyes calmly. Your journal said he attended the House of Cardell, and every student has a registration form. To tell you the truth, Vivian, I've looked around Miss Cardell's office and flipped through almost 300 forms that date back to a few years ago. The forms include the students we have right now, but your brother isn't there. There aren't any records about him. Do you know what that means? Vivian shook her head in disappointment. The forms prove nothing, Roy. I'm Miss Cardell's assistant, and I can see those papers easily if I want to. I know there's no record of him there, but so what? She asked, if the creature can erase memories, wouldn't removing a simple record be child's play? Roy couldn't answer that. Wow, she's more stubborn than I thought. It won't be easy to convince her. A creature that can erase anything it wants. Does she think it's Melitele or Lebioda? Where's the proof? Vivian continued. Did you forget, Roy? You saw the missing names in the entries. You can't think I did that on purpose, can you? Obviously, his name was removed along with everyone's memories. That's why there are blanks there. That's nonsense. What makes you think that? Roy retorted. But then he paused. An idea struck him. A blank appears where something is erased. He pondered on that statement, spacing out. When he went through the forms, there were a few empty ones among them. He didn't think much about them, supposing they were just Cardell's way of padding the number of students, but after hearing Vivian's explanation, he had another idea. A blank appears where something is erased. Could it be that the empty forms had records on them before this, but they were erased along with the memories of the missing students? That might be why they became blank papers nobody cares about. The memories about the missing people and the records as well as the pictures that prove they exist are erased, huh? Inspiration struck him, and he remembered something Toya had asked. Roy, who drew a pentagram on your left sleeve? And it's only half finished. I don't remember. Probably some cheeky kid in the house of Cardell. Probably did it when I wasn't looking. Roy looked at his left sleeve where the unfinished pentagram was drawn in charcoal. It had almost disappeared, leaving nothing but a faint corner. Everywhere else seemed to have been washed away, leaving no trace. There's no way daily wear and tear could erase the pentagram this cleanly. No, wait. The pentagram wasn't unfinished. It should have been a complete one in the first place. The simple shape had almost disappeared over the span of a few days, and Roy never imagined it to be evidence proving he'd forgotten about someone's existence. The traces of the missing people would be erased too. No wonder there are none. He could feel something weighing down on him, and he hyperventilated. In other words, ever since I came into this school, I was unconsciously forgetting someone, and that someone was the student who left this mark on my sleeve. And soon, our only clue will disappear. Join our Discord to chat about the series and get notified when a new chapter gets released. Chapter 40. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Reaper scans Chapter 40. Culprit, TL. Asuka, PR, Ash, Roy and Vivian were furiously flipping through the records in Miss Cardell's office. The owner of the office was standing behind them, looking at them coldly with her arms crossed. She was trying to find out what her student and assistant were doing after suddenly requesting a check on the records. 1256, 1257, 1258, 1259, 1260. They found 5 empty papers from the stacks of registration forms. Each corresponded to a year from 1256 to 1260. So there are 5 missing children. One for every year, Roy whispered to Vivian. This is a pattern, not a coincidence. What did you two find out? Shouldn't you be explaining this to me? Miss Cardell, you've been keeping tabs on the entry of students. Have you seen these empty records then? Miss Cardell took the papers. When she checked through them, a frown creased her forehead. These papers are custom-made. 1 piece for every student. They aren't cheap, and I don't waste money. But I might have put them in by mistake. They weren't empty in the first place, Roy explained. A student's record was on it, but they were erased along with everything that proved the student's existence. To be exact, the culprit took it away. You're starting to sound like Vivian. We're in Aldersburg, one of the biggest cities in the land. Nobody would dare kidnap my students under my nose. Not even the Sparrow Triad, Cardell argued. Unless you can produce more evidence, trying to pull a prank will warrant you an expulsion, Roy. If you want proof, you'll have to wait. He was the only one who'd seen the disappearance of the pentagram on his sleeve, and he couldn't prove it to anyone else, but he had a plan. Vivian, what's the date of his last appearance in your journal? I've read through it hundreds of times over the years. I can even recite them word by word, Vivian said. It was the 4th of October, 1258. That night, Bob slapped me in a drunken rage, and I came to the school, furious and fearful. He came with me too. You even agreed that his disappearance was between the 4th of October and Samhain. It was the 7th of October 1260 that day. The pentagram on his sleeve had almost disappeared, and the student that drew it must have disappeared between those dates. Since Vivian's brother's disappearance and the student's disappearance were around the same time, it couldn't have been a coincidence. Roy thought quickly. The incidents happening around October wasn't much of a lead, but then he considered the fact that Samhain was a month after that. The world of witchers ran the same course every living being would, it was a circle of life and death. There were 8 magical dates, corresponding to the important dates in the world. They were Samhain, Middenvern, Imbolc, Berk, Bellatine, Midit, Lammas, and Velan. The days closer to those dates were when magic would be at its strongest, making magical and supernatural phenomenons normal occurrences. If the culprit had chosen to make its move during those dates, it must have been a creature sensitive to magic. Roy made a note. The culprit has kidnapped 1 child every year since 1256, and the time frame is around Samhain. It could be a creature sensitive to mana. Possibly a monster or a human with magical talents. The second note went, the culprit will slowly erase most traces of its victims, including the memories of people around them, the words written by the victim, the portraits of the victims, as well as descriptions relating to the victim. Vivian, I recall you writing in your journal that you and your family had unconsciously overlooked him. I think so, Vivian answered. Since I want to be fair, I divided most of my attention equally to every student, so I ended up neglecting him. Vivian looked down. Bob's a drunkard, so he doesn't have time for him. He's always out for liquor. Mother's not in her right mind, so communication is out most of the time. So, he is someone overlooked by everyone. 5 victims. Even if the people around them have had their memories erased and the proof of their existence removed, none of their family members noticed something was wrong. None of them investigated. Roy wrote his conclusion. The culprit's target might be neglected children. That includes orphans. Maybe it's because of the culprit's selection method, or maybe it's because the culprit's cunning. Compared to popular people, if the victims are those who are neglected, then it wouldn't change the world too much. And it's harder to find out too, since it's more secretive. When Roy revealed his conclusions to the ladies, Vivian was surprised. She noticed everything Roy had written down, and she was clear about it, though she hadn't concluded so concisely. Cardell's nonchalance was finally broken, but she was still skeptical. Roy, the conclusions are scary, but still, you have no evidence to support them. Maybe your conclusions are wrong. Maybe there are no missing people. Evidence, huh? The best evidence is finding the culprit. Roy heaved a sigh. Miss Cardell, please don't doubt me for now. Give me your trust. The culprit takes 1 child from the school every year when it's near Samhain. Roy asked, don't you think something's off? The culprit is in the school. Vivian paled. It comes out when it's near Samhain to take a child away. Are you trying to say that? Impossible. Cardell shook her head. I know everyone here well, including the kitchen maids. On Lebioda's name, I swear that nobody's the culprit. I never said that the culprit was human. Roy had cast observe on everyone in the school, including the support staff. All of them were human, and none had the power to erase memories. It's most possibly a monster in the school. You have an idea what it is? Can't say for sure. Give me a minute. Roy didn't have any monster that fit the bill in mind, but that didn't mean he couldn't find out about it. He went out and circled the corridor for a while before taking out the notebook Letho left him, and then he went back into the room. The notebook had records about herbs, potions, and monsters, but since he was learning common speech, Roy didn't have time to read it. What is this? Vivian and Cardell gave him curious looks. A notebook left for me by a witcher. It contains information on various monsters. Maybe we can find the monster we're looking for here. Then they looked through the information on the monsters, and the more Roy read, the more shocked he was. He didn't know most of the monsters written in the notebook. So this world is more complex than I thought. After going through a dozen monsters, they stumbled upon an entry on a certain page. It said, "It's the end of autumn, the best season to hunt bears. Sarit and I stayed the night in a mountain village. The gales blew at night, and I could feel my bladder ready to burst. When I went to take a piss in the yard, my necklace started shaking. It was a soft vibration, and there wasn't much of a magical trace, but I knew a new prey was calling to me. Hunting monsters was more interesting than bears, especially since I knew nothing about it. That piss was a hint fate gave me. I found a rubber tree around 500 years old, and it had some complex signs on it. The manna came from that tree. I tried to use Ard, Igni, and even Necker feces on it, but nothing worked, until I used salt. It reacted to salt. The tree's roots opened its mouth in pain, revealing a deep, dark, tree hole for me. I woke Sarat up and went into the hole to fight that bastard. Disciple of the Viper School, and yes, that's you. Do not skip what I am about to tell you. I named the monster in the hole Separator/Child Hunter/Ghost in the tree. It's a slender, humanoid creature with a face that has a vague form, tough skin made out of something like wood, and sharp, poisonous fangs and claws. If it bites you, your limbs and nerves will slowly go numb. Here's a picture of it. Its speed and strength are on par with a regular human's, and it can regenerate quickly. Most sharp objects won't harm it fatally, but it's afraid of fire, salt, and necrophage oil. Once Sarat and I disposed of it, we found 15 carcasses in the hole, and the next day, we went around to talk to the villagers for 2 weeks. After much investigation, we found some information on it. It spends most of its time slumbering in the tree, only awakening when it's near Sawvine, then it would hunt nearby humans. Its targets are usually young humans, and it loves ones who are neglected. First, it will cover its prey in its puke, consuming it once it's died from asphyxiation. Its puke has an unbelievable effect. It can slowly separate its prey from the real world, and once the prey has been fully separated, the kill is done. Most traces of the prey will disappear, and everyone will forget about that poor soul. This is a monster that lives under old trees. One that eats people who are forgotten. Newbie, if you're reading this, that means you haven't passed the trial of the grasses yet. If you want to go up against this bastard, remember to equip yourself with the stuff it's weak against, and wear thicker clothes. If you manage to kill it, take its tongue and dry it under the sun. It's the most valuable part. Written by Ox, 6th of October 1204. Location: Berry Hill, Bicavaro, Nilfgaard. The trio looked at one another in silence. So that means something's living under the hornbeam. Cardell was incredulous. And it's been there for years. She gasped hoarsely. Impossible. How could I have not known about this? Then let's see if something's really there. Vivian clenched her fists, her face filled with resolve and hatred. I seem to recall us having a lot of salt in the kitchen. Roy took a deep breath and looked at the pentagram that had almost disappeared from his sleeve. The one I've forgotten could still be alive. Should I dive right into it? Join our Discord to chat about the series and get notified when a new chapter gets released.